June 4th, 1943. Railroad Street, Mexia, Texas. The train groaned as it slowed to a stop beneath the blinding noon sun. The air shimmered above the tracks, thick with heat and dust. From its cars stepped men in tattered uniforms, soldiers of the defeated Afrika Korps, their eyes hollow, their faces drawn. Behind the wire mesh of the troop train's windows, the prisoners squinted at a land so vast and foreign that it hardly seemed real. For months they had crossed oceans under armed guard, unsure where they were being taken. Now the wide sky stretched endlessly above them, blue and merciless. A few murmured to one another in German, their voices uncertain, their thoughts still trapped in the deserts of Tunisia. Among them was Obergefreiter Karl Weiss, 23 years old, a mechanic before the war. He had fought in Rommel US 21st Panzer Division and surrendered when his unit ran out of fuel and hope. The last thing he remembered from Africa was the burning smell of oil and sand mixed with cordite. The next was the cold steel of a ship's hull and the endless churn of waves. The guards, American MPs in pressed khaki, ordered them off the train. They marched in silence through the dust toward a line of army trucks waiting nearby. Weiss looked around. No bomb craters, no ruins, just farmland, flat, open, endless. He could smell the sweet scent of hay and diesel, hear the buzz of cicadas in the distance. It was a sound that belonged to peace, not war. When they arrived at the gates of the camp, the men were met by barbed wire and wooden guard towers. The sign read, Camp Hearne. Inside stood rows of freshly built barracks, neat and uniform. The wire fence was new. Its purpose clear, but not cruel. Weiss expected hostility, jeers, maybe even violence. But the guards said little. One officer with a clipboard called out names, checked papers, and gestured to assigned huts. "You'll be treated fairly," he said through a translator. "Follow the rules, and you'll have no trouble." For a moment, silence hung heavy. Then the gates clanged shut, sealing them inside. That night, as the heat faded, the camp settled into uneasy quiet. The prisoners were issued cots, soap, and rations, corned beef, bread, coffee. Weiss stared at the tin cup in his hands, baffled by the small mercy of it. In North Africa, water had been rationed by the mouthful. Here, it flowed from a spigot. Later, he lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of America, the whistle of a distant freight train, the hum of insects beyond the fence, the soft creak of wood cooling in the night air. Somewhere, someone played a harmonica, the tune wavering, almost mournful. Sleep came slowly, uneasy and shallow. He dreamed of home, of his mother's kitchen, the smell of bread baking, the laughter of his younger brother. When he awoke, it was dawn. Light poured through the cracks in the barrack walls, golden and calm. For a moment, he forgot where he was. The morning roll call was brisk. Each man was assigned a task: kitchen work, carpentry, farming detail. Some grumbled. Others were simply relieved to have purpose. The Americans watched from a distance, rifles slung but rarely raised. The war seemed far away here, as if it belonged to another world entirely. Days turned to weeks. The men adapted. The camp had its own order. Classes, sports, even a small theater built from scrap wood. Some of the prisoners began teaching English to one another. Others painted, carved, or wrote letters home they knew would never be answered. Weiss kept busy repairing broken tools and vehicles. His hands, idle for too long, found comfort in familiar work. The guards noticed his skill. Before long, he was given extra parts, a small workshop, and even permission to build a radio, though only one tuned to American stations. Through that tinny speaker came voices from a world untouched by ruin. Jazz, baseball, advertisements for things that didn't exist in wartime Germany, refrigerators, cars, laughter. Weiss listened in silence, unsure whether to envy or admire this strange land that had conquered his army, yet showed no hatred toward him. At night, the camp lights glowed softly against the horizon, visible from miles away. Locals from the nearby town sometimes drove past out of curiosity. Some even waved. To them, these Germans were no longer enemies, just men in uniform, far from home, working under the sun like everyone else. By autumn, the fields outside the wire were golden with wheat. The prisoners helped harvest it under guard, their sweat mixing with that of American laborers. Barriers blurred. Words were exchanged. A few Texans began to see them not as invaders, but as fellow workers caught in the same heat, the same soil. One evening, after a long day's work, Weiss stood near the fence, watching the sky burn orange over the plains. He thought of the propaganda lectures he'd been fed back in Europe, the stories of American greed and cruelty. None of it matched what he saw here. He thought of the guards who offered him coffee when he fixed their trucks, of the camp cook who smuggled him extra bread, of the way no one spat when he passed. It unsettled him more than any beating could have. War had taught him to expect hate. But here, in this quiet place behind barbed wire, he found only the unnerving kindness of ordinary men. That night, a storm rolled in from the south. Thunder cracked over the prairie, rain hammering the tin roofs. The barracks leaked, the floors flooded, yet laughter echoed through the darkness. Someone shouted that it smelled like home. For the first time since his capture, Carl Weiss laughed too. When the rain stopped, the air was cool, the earth steaming under a pale moon. The fence glistened with droplets that caught the light like glass. Weiss reached out and touched one of the wires. It was slick and cold, but in that moment it didn't feel like a prison. It felt like the thin edge between who he had been and who he might still become. He didn't know it yet, but Camp Hearne would change him, as it changed thousands of others. Behind that fence, far from the battlefields that had scarred them, men like Weiss would relearn something their war had stolen, that even in captivity, dignity could survive, and sometimes mercy could win where bullets could not. Winter came early to Texas in 1943. The fields around Camp Hearne turned a pale gold, the air still and dry beneath the endless blue sky. For the German prisoners, it was their first Christmas in captivity, a holiday they expected to pass in silence, perhaps marked by a meager meal and the ache of distance from home. But America, it seemed, had other plans. On Christmas Eve, the guards opened the gates between the compounds. Prisoners who had spent months separated by rank and ideology, enlisted men in one section, officers in another, were allowed to gather for worship. Inside the camp theater, built by the prisoners themselves, candles flickered on a makeshift altar constructed from scrap wood and canvas. The camp orchestra, composed of former musicians from Leipzig, Hamburg, and Vienna, tuned their instruments. They had been provided violins, clarinets, even a piano salvaged from a local church basement. That night, under a ceiling of pine garlands and hand-painted stars, the first notes of Stille Nacht filled the air. Guards paused at their posts to listen. Some removed their caps. Others quietly hummed along. In the stillness of that Texas night, the boundaries between captor and captive blurred, if only for a few minutes. Reports from the Swiss Red Cross described the scene vividly. The prisoners conducted themselves with remarkable decorum. The music was of high quality, and the American staff showed deep respect. The atmosphere was one of mutual humanity. When the final hymn ended, Lieutenant Colonel Stiles stepped forward, his voice soft but clear. "Gentlemen," he said in German, "you are far from your homes, but tonight you are not forgotten." Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then warm, then thunderous. For many prisoners, it was the moment they stopped feeling like enemies and started feeling like men again. In the months that followed, life inside Camp Hearne began to take on a rhythm. The prisoners established schools, mathematics, literature, even engineering courses taught by former professors among them. The U.S. Army approved textbooks, provided supplies, and allowed correspondence with American universities for credit. Within a year, more than 200 prisoners were enrolled in distance programs. The Americans believed education would prevent unrest. What they did not realize was that it was also reshaping minds. Lectures on democracy, science, and philosophy began quietly, often under the guise of language lessons. Prisoners read translated copies of the Federalist Papers, Mark Twain, and Walt Whitman. One German teacher, a former Nazi Party instructor named Karl Reiner, later admitted, "It was in those barracks, not in Berlin, that I first understood what freedom of thought truly meant." Beyond the fences, the world was changing too. Local townsfolk, cautious at first, grew curious about the strange visitors behind barbed wire. Farmers who hired prisoner labor soon discovered that many of them were polite, efficient, and grateful. A farmer named Sam Collins from Navasota remembered decades later, "They worked hard, always singing. One of them fixed my tractor with a piece of wire and said it D-run another year. Damn thing ran 3. The Germans began leaving their mark on Texas soil, repairing irrigation ditches, building barns, and harvesting crops that fed American soldiers overseas. In return, they were paid in scrip and trust. That trust deepened when the war's violence came close to home. In April 1944, a tornado struck near Hearne, ripping through barns and fences. Several POWs working in the fields could have fled during the chaos. None did. Instead, they joined the rescue efforts carrying injured civilians to safety. Newspapers across Texas ran headlines the next day, "German prisoners help save local families." The story reached Washington. The War Department praised their conduct. But to the men in the camp, no medals were needed. They had simply done what decent men should do. As the months passed, something else began to change: the tone of the letters home. At first, they were cautious, filled with the rhetoric of loyalty and endurance. But as 1944 unfolded, the letters softened. They spoke of kindness, of fairness, of a nation that seemed impossibly rich, yet strangely humble. "I have seen the real enemy," one wrote to his wife in Bremen, "and it is not America. It is ignorance." Not all prisoners welcomed these transformations. Within the compounds, Nazi loyalists tried to maintain control, enforcing ideological discipline through intimidation. They held secret meetings, burned books they deemed un-German, and punished dissenters. But the cracks were widening. In late summer 1944, after D-Day, the American Guards noticed something subtle. The swastika flags that had once hung in certain barracks were disappearing. Prisoners began painting murals instead, landscapes, portraits, and scenes of the Texas countryside. The most famous of these, still preserved today in Hearne, was titled Der Weg nach Hause, The Road Home. It depicted a soldier walking through an open gate toward a sunrise. Even the most devout Nazis could not stop time. When news of the failed assassination attempt on Hitler reached the camp that July, the reaction was divided. Some prisoners shouted with anger, others, quietly, with relief. That night, one of the German pastors in the camp chapel changed his sermon. He spoke not of loyalty, but of conscience. "Obedience without thought," he said, "is the death of the soul." The next morning, graffiti appeared on a barrack wall, a simple phrase in chalk, "Nie wieder," never again. The guards saw it. They did not erase it. That fall, Camp Hearne received a new group of prisoners, young, frightened conscripts captured in France, many barely 18. The older men, once soldiers of the Desert War, took them under their wing. They taught them English, carpentry, even how to read blueprints. One American sergeant noted in his report, "These Germans are raising their own next generation differently. You can see it in their eyes." By December 1944, Christmas returned once more. This time it was the Americans who asked to join the service. The prisoners agreed. Inside the same wooden theater, U.S. guards sat beside German officers, listening as the orchestra played "O Come All, Ye Faithful." When the final hymn ended, the lights dimmed and a single projector illuminated the back wall, an image the prisoners had painted themselves. A nativity scene set not in Bethlehem, but in a Texas barn with shepherds wearing khaki uniforms and a star rising above a wire fence. It was meant as a gift, a quiet message that peace could exist even among barbed wire and sentries. That winter, word began to spread across other camps, in Oklahoma, Nebraska, Georgia, and Wisconsin. The Germans at Hearne had changed. They worked hard, obeyed rules, and helped their hosts. But more than that, they began to believe in something else. The Swiss delegate Sandstrom wrote in his 1945 report, "Many German prisoners now express admiration for the American system. They ask questions about democracy, about elections, about newspapers free from censorship. It is clear that for them, captivity has become a classroom." By war's end, the lessons learned inside those fences would ripple far beyond Texas. Some men returned home ashamed of their old beliefs. Others carried with them the seeds of a new Germany. And a few, perhaps the most haunted of all, never left America. Among them was a young corporal named Georg Gertner, the same man whose life had been saved in the camp hospital 2 years earlier. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Gertner faced repatriation and the prospect of returning to a country in ruins. One night, as the camp prepared for closure, he vanished. For 40 years, no one knew where he went. But that is another story. The final chapter of how a man once sworn to a dictator found freedom in the land that captured him. May 1945. The guns of Europe fell silent. In Texas, the cicadas sang again. The war that had begun with 1,000 speeches and ended in 1,000 ruins was finally over. Across the ocean, Germany lay in ashes, cities flattened, families scattered, faith extinguished. And yet, in the stillness of Camp Hearne, the men who had once marched for Hitler found themselves strangely unready to leave. The order for repatriation came in June. One by one, the compounds emptied. Trucks lined the dirt roads, carrying men who had planted fields, played orchestras, written essays, and built furniture now sturdy enough to outlast the war itself. They were going home, or what was left of it. For many, the departure was bittersweet. The Americans had treated them not as beasts, but as men. They had seen kindness where they had expected vengeance, fairness where they had known cruelty. They had seen, in quiet gestures, a mirror of what their own nation might have been if it had chosen a different path. On the final morning, the camp loudspeakers played the Star-Spangled Banner as the German flag was lowered one last time. The guards saluted. So did the prisoners. One man, a former Luftwaffe pilot named Dieter Hahn, turned to a U.S. sergeant and said, "When I return home, I will tell them. The Americans do not fight with hate." The sergeant nodded. Just don't forget. But forgetting was never the danger. The danger was disbelief. When the first ships carrying POWs reached Bremen and Hamburg, the men stepped onto soil they no longer recognized. Their uniforms were gone, their ranks meaningless. The cities were fields of rubble, silent except for the rustle of ration lines and the murmur of foreign languages. British and American military police guided the returnees through registration centers. Some German civilians stared at them with suspicion, others with pity. "Prisoner of war," one woman muttered. "Then you were lucky." Lucky. For men like Herman Butcher, the word felt heavy. He wrote in his diary that autumn, "I came home to ruins, but I brought with me something that could not be bombed, an idea." That idea, of liberty not as chaos but as conscience, spread quietly among the returnees. Many of the 372,000 German POWs repatriated from America between 1945 and 1946 became unexpected apostles of democracy. Historians later called them the Camp Universities generation. They had studied American civics behind barbed wire, read translated U.S. newspapers, and debated free thought in the desert heat. Now they would teach those lessons to a broken nation, In the town of Göttingen, a former Afrika Korps sergeant named Fritz Müller opened a small vocational school. Its motto, painted in English on the wall, read simply, "Freedom through knowledge." In Bonn, a one-time artillery officer became a teacher of American literature, introducing students to Emerson and Thoreau. "We had seen power without cruelty," he told them, "and we must learn it ourselves." Others entered politics. Quietly at first, then more openly, as West Germany began to rebuild. The democratic structures that emerged in the late 1940s owed much to the quiet conviction of men who had once believed in absolute obedience but had learned its price. They remembered the camps not as prisons, but as classrooms. But not all returned. Some, like Georg Gärtner, refused repatriation altogether. In September 1945, Gärtner escaped from a POW train bound for New York, slipping away under the cover of darkness. For decades, the U.S. Army listed him as a fugitive, the last escaped German prisoner of war on American soil. He took a new name, Dennis F. Wiles, and wandered through the vast American West. He worked as a carpenter in Colorado, a ski instructor in New Mexico, a mechanic in California. He fell in love with an American woman who never knew his past. For 40 years, he lived in quiet exile, building a life from the fragments of two identities. When his secret was finally revealed in 1985, America's reaction was not outrage. It was curiosity. The government declined to prosecute. The war was long over. When a journalist asked him why he had never returned to Germany, Gärtner smiled faintly. "Because," he said, "in America I became free." His story, like so many others, reflected a strange symmetry. A war of ideas in which the victors conquered not only through force, but through example. For the American guards and civilians who had shared those years, the memory endured as well. Farmers in Texas still spoke fondly of the German boys who had worked their land. Churches remembered the Christmas concerts, the carved crosses left behind in chapels, the hand-painted murals still visible beneath layers of dust. One of those murals, the sunrise behind barbed wire, remains today, carefully preserved inside a museum near the old campgrounds. Visitors often remark that it feels alive, as if the artist had stepped away only moments ago. Beneath it, a small plaque bears a single line from a letter found in the archives. "They tried to show us what humanity meant, and in doing so, they defeated us more completely than any army ever could." By the early 1950s, most of the former prisoners had rebuilt their lives. Some became teachers, others engineers. A few even rose to positions in West Germany, as new armed forces, the Bundeswehr, where they taught a new generation of soldiers the values of restraint and duty under law. Herman Butcher published his memoir Behind Barbed Wire in 1952, not as an apology, but as a confession. "We entered America as enemies," he wrote, "but we left as students." His words were quoted in schools across the new republic. For the rest of his life, he corresponded with his former American guards, exchanging Christmas cards, photographs of grandchildren, and letters that spoke not of war, but of weather, of harvests, of shared humanity. When he died in 1971, one of those guards, now an old man himself, sent a wreath of bluebonnets, the state flower of Texas, to be placed on his grave. In the decades that followed, historians would look back on the American prisoner of war program as one of the most humane in modern history. It was not without flaws. There were mistakes, injustices, moments of arrogance. But in its core, it reflected a principle the United States had dared to test in the crucible of global war, that even in victory, mercy was strength. The men who passed through those camps carried that lesson home, whether to the red soil of Texas or the gray streets of Bremen. And when their children asked them what it had been like, they did not speak of suffering. They spoke of discovery, of kindness behind wire, of Christmas hymns sung in a foreign tongue, of freedom learned from the very people who had captured them. In the quiet of the Texas plains, where the wind still hums across the old foundations of Camp Hearne, the echoes of their voices remain, not as ghosts of war, but as witnesses to the strange, improbable truth that humanity, even among enemies, can endure. And in that endurance, perhaps, lies the real victory. The years turned, and the war that once divided continents faded into memory. But some memories refused to fade. Decades after the last German prisoner boarded his ship home, the fields of Hearne, Texas, still whisper their story. The barbed wire is gone now. The guard towers have fallen to time. Only fragments remain. A stretch of concrete, a rusted gate hinge, a small museum standing where the main compound once stood. Yet, if you walk there in the early morning, when the mist lifts off the prairie grass, you can almost hear it. The sound of distant laughter, of hammers against wood, of music drifting through the open air. It is hard to imagine that this quiet place once held thousands of men at war with the world. Harder still to imagine that within these fences, they discovered peace. In the decades that followed, the world changed in ways few could have foreseen. The Germany that returned from ruin would rise again, not through conquest, but through conscience. The men who had labored under the Texas sun became teachers, architects, lawmakers, and fathers of a new republic founded not on fear, but on freedom. They carried with them lessons learned from the very nation that had defeated them, that strength without compassion is fragile and power without mercy soon devours itself. In 1949, the Federal Republic of Germany was born, and in its founding documents, echoes of American ideals could be heard: freedom of speech, rule of law, the dignity of the individual. Concepts first encountered by German soldiers behind American fences now form the backbone of their democracy. By the time President Kennedy stood before the Berlin Wall in 1963 and declared, "Ich bin ein Berliner," the transformation was complete. The enemies of one generation had become the allies of the next. It was not coincidence, it was consequence. The spirit that had animated Camp Hearne, and hundreds of other camps like it, had taken root far beyond the Texas plains. It proved that compassion could be strategic, that mercy could be victorious, and that sometimes the surest way to conquer hatred was to refuse to mirror it. In the archives of the National Biptud Museum, a letter from a former POW lies carefully preserved. It is addressed not to a commander, but to a friend, a guard named James Wilcox. Written in 1948, the letter reads, "You treated me like a man when I was at my lowest. You gave me back the belief that a better Germany was still possible. If you ever come to Bremen, there will always be a place at my table." Wilcox never made the journey, but his grandson did 70 years later, carrying the same letter folded in his coat pocket. At the Butcher family home in Bremen, he was greeted not as a stranger, but as kin. Together they stood in silence before a small photograph. Young soldiers on opposite sides of a war, smiling beneath a Texas sun. The world they had inherited was built on the quiet courage of moments like that. Moments when mercy triumphed over vengeance, when the victors chose to build rather than break. Today, Germany and the United States stand side by side, allies bound not just by treaties, but by memory. Every joint mission, every peacekeeping effort, every handshake between their leaders carries an unspoken truth born from those distant camps. That reconciliation is not weakness, it is wisdom. And if you listen closely, across the wind that sweeps through Hearne, across the Rhine, across the Atlantic, you can still hear it, the echo of men who once fought each other, learning instead to rebuild a world together. Their story is not just about captivity or war. It is about the quiet revolution that begins when compassion defies hatred, and humanity endures where it is least expected. As the sun sets over the old campgrounds, the horizon glows gold, the same light that once guided them home, and in that light the lesson remains. Freedom is strongest when it is shared. Peace is lasting when it is learned, and the truest victory is the one that heals. 80 years have passed. The war that once engulfed the world now belongs to history books and fading photographs. But the lessons born in captivity, in those quiet Texas fields, have not dimmed. The old men who once wore field gray uniforms are gone now. Their voices, once filled with defiance or doubt, have faded into the hum of time. But their stories remain, not carved in stone, but etched in the small mercies that outlived them. At the Camp Hearne historical site, a guide still tells visitors how enemies became neighbors. Children walk among the reconstructed barracks, touching the weathered wood, asking questions their grandparents never dared to ask. Who were these men? Why were they treated so well? And what did they learn? In the visitor's book, one entry stands out, written in careful German handwriting. Ich kam als Tourist. Ich ging als Enkel. I came as a tourist. I left as a grandson. The handwriting belongs to a young German man from Munich, the grandson of one of the prisoners once held here. He wrote that his grandfather never spoke of the war, but every Christmas he would light a single candle and whisper, "For Texas, for Texas." When asked why, he said, "Because that is where I found forgiveness." There is something profoundly human in that. The idea that redemption can bloom even in places built for confinement. That a fence meant to divide can become, in time, a bridge. In 2008, when a tornado swept through the Hearne area once again, volunteers came from across the state to help rebuild the small museum that had been damaged. Among them were German tourists, descendants of former POWs. They worked side by side with Texans, hammering, sawing, laughing. No uniforms, no ranks, no sides, just people. When the restoration was complete, they planted a live oak tree in the center of the old compound. A small plaque at its base reads, "To memory and mercy may both take root." Today, that tree stands tall, its branches casting shade across the grass where once there were barracks. Each spring, it blossoms early, as if impatient to remind the world that peace, too, can grow. Far beyond Texas, in schools and universities across both nations, the story of America's treatment of German POWs is still taught, not as propaganda, but as proof of principle. That democracy, at its best, does not merely defeat its enemies, it transforms them. It is a story retold in classrooms, in documentaries, in whispered family anecdotes. A story of guards who became teachers, of prisoners who became reformers, of kindness that changed the course of nations. The echo of that kindness can still be heard in the quiet alliances of the modern age, in humanitarian missions, in reconstruction efforts, in soldiers offering food instead of fear. Each gesture, however small, is a descendant of that long-ago mercy shown behind barbed wire. History often remembers the wars men fight. It rarely remembers how they make peace. But here, among the wildflowers of Texas and the cobblestones of Bremen, peace was not made in conference halls or treaties. It was made in small acts, in a medic's steady hand, in a guard's patience, in a shared hymn on a cold December night. Those acts became a language all their own, one that spoke not of victory, but of understanding. And maybe that is the final legacy of Camp Hearne and the thousands like it, that in the very heart of war, men discovered the blueprint for peace. As the sun sets beyond the horizon, the light fades softly over the field. The oak tree rustles in the breeze. A lone bird crosses the sky, its wings catching the final glow. And somewhere in the echo of that wind, you can still hear it, the quiet promise left behind by those who once called this place home. We were enemies, but we learned to be men again.